So just to give a brief description of Kriya, for those that are new to the path or may not have received the initiation, we can describe it in just briefly like this. Kriya is a technique of using the breath, using the concentrated attention or mind, and using the life energy in the body to awaken higher states of consciousness. Remember those words I quoted a few minutes ago from the Gita? When the yogi, like a tortoise, withdrawing its limbs, can fully retire his senses from the objects of perception, then his wisdom manifests steadiness. So with this technique of Kriya Yoga, by a special kind of breathing, accompanied by mental concentration, the life energy is withdrawn, just like that tortoise withdrawing his limbs. The life energy is withdrawn from its outer flow to the senses. Those senses that keep the mind attached and absorbed in all the outer pursuits and desires and attachments, the kinds of outer turmoil that creates the inner distress that we're all familiar with. Kriya reverses that flow. It pulls those subtle electrical or pranic currents, that subtle electricity of prana, life force. It pulls it away from the senses, away from the outer surface of the body, into a subtle passageway in the spine. And it circulates that current up and down the spine, accompanied by that special technique of breathing and concentration. And by that circulation in the spine, as it is repeated over and over again, two things happen. Two things happen to the Kriya Yogi. First, there's a magnet created in the spine, a magnetic polarity between the base of the spine and the brain, between the Kundalini center, the coccyx center at the bottom of the spine, and the Krishna consciousness or Christ consciousness center here at the point between the eyebrows in the brain. This Kutastha center becomes the positive pole, the coccyx center becomes the negative pole, and that creates a magnet which is made increasingly more powerful with each repetition of the Kriya technique. And here's the thing. The more powerful that magnet becomes, the more effective it is in pulling the energy, pulling the life force, pulling the consciousness away from the senses, away from its attachments and absorption in the outer world, and concentrating it in the subtlest passageway in the spine. Guruji said, spine and brain are where you will find the altar of God. So the second thing it does is this. As that energy is withdrawn from the senses by the Kriya breath and is circulated by the technique, by the concentrated mind, is circulated upward and downward within the spinal axis, it awakens the chakras. So it pulls the prana away from the outer instruments of sensory perception, eventually calming them and completely shutting them off, giving us a state of inner peace, inner tranquility. And secondly, it awakens those inner instruments of divine perception, those 7 chakras, 7 centers in the cerebrospinal axis. This is a very simplified and abbreviated description, but I'm just pointing it out to give a glimpse of what it is and really to point out what is the effect. What happens as we practice this technique up and down the spine, that special technique, that advanced practice of Kriya Yoga? What is the effect? Peace, calmness, great happiness, freedom from fear, freedom from anxiety, and ultimately bliss consciousness, which is God consciousness. Guruji told us another story, this one in India. He said there was a man that he knew in Calcutta who had a terrible temper, always losing his temper. And Guruji said, he was a specialist in slapping his bosses when he lost his temper. So he would lose one job after another. And so he came to me and he asked for help. And I told him, I said, next time you get angry, don't lash out. Count to 100 before you say anything, before you act. Well, this man, he tried it out. But then he came back to Guruji and he said, it doesn't work. I get more angry when I do that. While I'm counting, I'm actually blind with rage for having to wait so long. And Guruji said his case looked quite hopeless. But then he said, I told him to practice Kriya Yoga. And he said, he gave him this instruction. After practicing your Kriya, think that the divine light is going into your brain, soothing it, calming your nerves, calming your emotions, wiping away all anger. And one day your temper tantrums will be gone. Isn't that a beautiful formula? Just close your eyes for a minute and let that sink in as a wonderful spiritual tool. Do your Kriya and then think that the divine light is going into your brain, soothing it, calming your nerves, calming your emotions. And Guruji said, not long after he had given that suggestion to this gentleman, he said, he came back to me and he said, I am free from the habit of anger. I'm so thankful to you. Guruji was very practical and he said, I decided to give him a test. And so I arranged for some boys to pick a quarrel with him. And I hid myself in the park along the route where he used to pass by regularly so I could observe him. You know, such a spiritual scientist, he wasn't taking anyone's word for it so that he could observe it. The boys, he said, tried again and again to goad him into a fight, but he wouldn't respond. He kept his calmness. So there you have it, the power of Kriya Yoga. And of course, the point is not just about anger, about all the forms of psychological and emotional turmoil that we've mentioned, that we have to contend with in our lives in this world, in our lives in these mortal bodies, interacting with different people, interacting most of all with our own ego, isn't it? Those forms of emotional and psychological turmoil, fear and greed and lust, anxiety, stress, and so on, all of those things that cause us misery, and they make our lives hell on earth. Well, Kriya Yoga makes it a heaven on earth. How does Kriya Yoga help to calm the inner and outer turmoil, to rise above stress and anxiety? Never forget, the answer to that question can't really be fully explained in words, in theoretical descriptions or metaphors. It has to be experienced. The answer to that question of being victorious over the inner and outer turmoil, it comes in the actual feeling of those vibratory currents circulating within the spinal column, within the sushumna, drawing our consciousness within to the feet of the omnipresent living God. You know, when we think about stress, we think about turmoil. It's true, we can get some peace of mind, some inner calmness, some stability by practicing affirmations, by practicing mental control, perhaps, by visualizations and so on. These are good, these are helpful. But all of these mental and psychological methods, they are like droplets of water compared to the mighty river of spiritual consciousness, of spiritual peace, of spiritual joy that we can immerse ourselves in through the Kriya technique. Never forget that. Never take for granted the great blessing, the great power of that technique. the SRF YSS lessons that Paramahansa Yogananda has created, these contain the most clear, the most complete and understandable and applicable description and method of learning and practicing Kriya Yoga. Those lessons that each of you can receive in many different languages. And I tell you, you will not find anything else in the world more clear than this, either through even an in-person teacher, and certainly not through some compilation of instructions put together by somebody who maybe attended a few lectures or practiced meditation for a few years. I'm sorry to say these are not sufficient. But you will never find, I want to repeat this, you will never find a more complete or better presentation of the technique of Kriya Yoga than is given in the YSS and SRF lessons. And particularly this new edition, which came out a few years ago, vastly expanded and improved. The world is a very chaotic, a very difficult place. But what a joy, what a comfort to know that Kriya Yoga, as taught by this lineage of enlightened masters, that provides a practical, a powerful solution to both the external and the internal challenges that each of us faces.